They are all standing for you, sir.
I never expected all this. Thank you for everything.
A CEO mocked a black girl for feeding a veteran. By noon, 50 officers saluted her and shut him down. Full narrator-only voiceover script, extended version. At 7 in the morning, nobody in that city knew her name. By noon, 50 police officers stood on a public sidewalk in full uniform, back straight, hands raised in salute, honoring a 29-year-old woman named Maya Coleman, while the most powerful man in the city stood frozen behind her, humiliated, in front of his own cameras. Nobody planned this moment. Nobody could have scripted it. It happened because one woman refused to stop being kind, even when a man with more money than she could imagine tried to make her feel small in front of strangers. By the end of that single morning, his empire would tremble, his reputation would crack open, and the woman he mocked would become the reason an entire city stopped and paid attention. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By noon, the most powerful man in that city would be begging her forgiveness. But at 7 that morning, he didn't even think she deserved a seat. Richard Vance walked into that diner, already convinced he owned it, along with everything else on that block. He had signed papers that morning that made him believe the whole street belonged to him already, even the people inside it. What he did not know was that the woman pouring coffee behind that counter carried more quiet strength than every deed and contract sitting in his briefcase. He also did not know that the old man sitting alone in the corner booth, the one he was about to embarrass, in front of a rolling camera, was someone the entire police department would come running for before the sun reached its highest point. Who was Maya Coleman before that morning made her a name people would never forget? She was nobody special in the eyes of a man like Richard Vance, and that was exactly the mistake he made. She worked the early shift at a small diner near the financial district, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a coffee pot that never went empty. She was a single mother raising a daughter on tips and long hours, the kind of woman who counted coins at the end of her shift and still found a way to smile at every customer who walked through that door. She wasn't rich, she wasn't connected, and she wasn't looking for attention. She simply believed that no one who walked into her diner should ever have to sit there hungry, especially not a quiet old veteran named Walter Higgins, who came in every single morning and never once asked her for anything. Maya had grown up in that same neighborhood, 2 streets over from the diner where she now worked, raised by a grandmother who ran a small sewing business out of her living room and taught her that dignity had nothing to do with money. Her own mother had left when she was young, and her father had never been part of the picture at all, so it was her grandmother's voice she carried with her through every difficult season of her life. She had dreamed once of finishing college, of becoming a nurse, of building something larger than the 4 walls of a diner, but life had rearranged those plans the moment she became a mother at 22. She never spoke of those dreams with bitterness. She simply folded them quietly into the back of her mind and focused instead on raising her daughter with the same steady values her grandmother had given her. Her daughter, an 11-year-old named Aaliyah, was the center of everything Maya did, the reason she woke before dawn each morning, and the reason she never allowed exhaustion to turn into resentment. Aaliyah attended a public school a few blocks from their apartment, and Maya made it a point, no matter how tired she was, to walk her there herself before starting her shift. Their apartment was small, the furniture second-hand, but it was warm, filled with photographs of Maya's grandmother and hand-drawn pictures Aaliyah had made over the years. Money was often tight enough that Maya skipped her own meals some days to make sure there was enough for her daughter, a sacrifice she never mentioned to anyone, including the customers who saw only her steady smile each morning. Walter Higgins had been coming to that diner for almost 3 years, always sitting in the same corner booth, always ordering the cheapest thing on the menu, even when Maya knew he could barely afford it. She never said a word about it. She simply started bringing him a full breakfast anyway, quietly placing it in front of him before he could object, telling him it was already paid for even when it wasn't. He would nod, eat slowly, and leave a folded napkin behind with a few coins he clearly could not spare. Neither of them ever spoke about why he came alone every day, or why his eyes sometimes lingered too long on the door whenever it opened. Maya never asked questions. She only knew that something in this quiet man deserved kindness, even if the rest of the world had stopped noticing him. Walter lived alone in a small apartment above a hardware store several blocks from the diner, a space so sparse that visitors might have mistaken it for someone just passing through rather than a permanent home. He kept few possessions, most of them tucked into a single wooden box beneath his bed, containing photographs, letters, and a medal he had not looked at directly in years. His wife had passed nearly a decade earlier, and the two children they raised together now lived states away, calling on holidays but rarely visiting in person. He filled his days with quiet routines: a walk in the morning, breakfast at Maya's diner, an afternoon spent reading at the small public library nearby, and evenings spent mostly in silence, the kind of silence that comes from a life spent trying to forget more than remember. What none of the regulars at that diner knew, and what Maya herself did not fully understand yet, was that Walter Higgins carried a history far heavier than his quiet mornings suggested. Tucked inside his coat pocket was a photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and pinned beneath his collar, hidden from view, was a medal he never spoke about to anyone. He had spent decades trying to disappear into ordinary life after leaving behind a career that once commanded respect from men who now wore badges across that very city. He wanted nothing from anyone, least of all recognition. He simply wanted a warm plate of food and a few quiet minutes each morning before the noise of the world caught up to him again. He had no idea that morning that his ordinary routine was about to collide with a man who believed the whole street already belonged to him. Decades earlier, before the quiet retirement that defined his later years, Walter had built a reputation within law enforcement circles as a demanding but deeply respected trainer, someone who shaped young recruits into officers capable of leading with both discipline and compassion. He had walked away from that role voluntarily, exhausted after years of carrying responsibility for lives far beyond his own, choosing instead a life of anonymity that allowed him to simply exist without expectation. Many of the officers he trained had gone on to hold significant positions within the department, yet none of them had spoken with him in years, respecting the distance he had deliberately created around himself. He never imagined that distance would collapse in a single morning, forced open by a stranger's cruelty rather than his own choosing. Richard Vance had built his fortune buying up blocks like this one, promising revitalization while quietly pricing out the people who had lived and worked there for years. He came from a family with modest means himself, a detail his publicity team rarely mentioned, having built his empire through aggressive negotiation tactics and a willingness to outlast competitors rather than inherited privilege. Over the past decade, he had acquired dozens of properties across the city, transforming struggling neighborhoods into profitable developments while displacing long-time residents who could no longer afford rising costs. He justified this pattern publicly as necessary progress, insisting that growth required sacrifice. Though critics increasingly accused him of profiting from communities he showed little genuine interest in preserving. That morning, he arrived at Maya's diner for what his publicity team called an authentic community visit. A carefully staged appearance meant to soften his image before the public learned about his latest acquisition. He wanted cameras rolling while he shook a few hands and smiled for a photograph that would later appear in a glossy press release. His assistant, a young woman named Patricia Delgado, who had worked for him for nearly 2 years, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with these staged appearances, sensing they existed only to manufacture goodwill rather than reflect genuine care. She had mentioned her concerns to him once, quietly, and been told firmly that perception mattered more than substance, a philosophy that would prove costly within hours of that particular morning. What he did not expect was to find a woman quietly serving free food to an old man in a corner booth, and what he could not tolerate was the idea that anyone in his world might be giving something away for free, especially not on property he now considered his own. Vance had signed papers only days earlier, finalizing an agreement to acquire that block, a deal he believed remained confidential until his official announcement. Walking into that diner, he saw not simply a business transaction unfolding, but living proof of his growing power, and Maya's quiet generosity struck him as a small but visible reminder that not everyone in that space yet understood who truly controlled it now. The moment Richard Vance noticed Maya setting a plate in front of Walter without payment, his expression shifted from practiced charm to open irritation. He raised his voice loud enough for the cameras and the customers nearby to hear, accusing her of running a personal charity on his dime, mocking her for wasting food on, in his words, people who don't pay their way. Maya froze for only a second before straightening her back and looking him directly in the eye, her voice calm, even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Walter tried to speak up in her defense, and Vance dismissed him just as quickly, waving him off like an inconvenience, rather than a man who had once commanded far more respect than anyone in that room could imagine. Neither of them noticed the phone quietly recording every word from a nearby table. Maya did not raise her voice back at him, and that quiet restraint would later become one of the most talked-about parts of the entire encounter. She simply told him that the meal was already accounted for, that it came from her own pocket and not his budget, and that no man walking into her diner for a photograph had any right to decide who deserved breakfast and who did not. Vance laughed, the kind of laugh meant to belittle rather than amuse, and told her that people like her needed to understand who really controlled that block now. He gestured toward the walls, the tables, even the floor beneath their feet, as though ownership of brick and concrete somehow gave him ownership of her character. Maya did not flinch. She simply reached for the coffee pot and kept working, refusing to give him the reaction he clearly wanted in front of his cameras. Other customers in the diner that morning sat in uncomfortable silence, some pretending to focus on their meals, while others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene in a confrontation between a wealthy stranger and a woman most of them had known for years. An older man near the counter, a retired mechanic who ate breakfast there most mornings, later told reporters he had considered speaking up, but hesitated, worried about the consequences of confronting someone with obvious power and influence. That hesitation, he admitted afterward, stayed with him long after the story became public, a quiet regret shared by several witnesses who wished they had said something in the moment, rather than staying silent out of fear. The woman recording from the corner table had no idea what she was about to unleash. She had walked in that morning, simply looking for a quiet breakfast before her shift at a nearby pharmacy, and instead found herself capturing a moment that would ripple far beyond that diner's four walls. Her name was Denise Foster, though she would remain largely anonymous throughout the unfolding story, preferring to let the footage speak rather than seeking attention for herself. She posted the video within minutes of leaving, tagging it only with the name of the diner and a caption expressing disbelief at what she had just witnessed. Within an hour, the video had crossed a few thousand views. By mid-morning, it had crossed a few 100,000, pulled into wider circulation by local accounts, community pages, and eventually larger outlets, hungry for a story about power and cruelty colliding with quiet dignity. Richard Vance, still unaware of the recording, walked out of that diner believing his morning had gone exactly as planned, climbing into his car while reviewing notes for a lunch meeting scheduled later that day. He mentioned briefly to his driver that the diner visit had gone smoothly enough, unaware that Patricia, sitting quietly in the front seat, had already begun receiving concerned messages from colleagues who had seen the footage circulating online. She said nothing at first, uncertain how to raise the subject, watching him scroll through unrelated emails while the digital storm building around him remained entirely invisible from where he sat. By the time Vance's car pulled away from the curb, phones across the city were already lighting up with notifications. Comment sections filled instantly with outrage directed at the man in the video, while praise poured in for the woman who had stood her ground without ever raising her voice. Strangers who had never set foot in that diner began sharing details about Maya, some accurate and some exaggerated, painting her as a symbol of quiet resistance against wealth that believed it could buy respect along with real estate. Meanwhile, questions began circulating about the elderly man in the corner booth, with a few sharp-eyed viewers pausing the footage on his collar, noticing something small and metallic catching the light, something that looked distinctly official rather than ordinary. A local news producer, scrolling through trending topics during her morning routine, noticed the video's rapid climb and immediately flagged it for her assignment desk, recognizing the makings of a story with far more reach than typical viral clips. Within an hour, a small crew had been dispatched toward the diner, hoping to gather follow-up interviews before competing outlets arrived first. This early movement by local media would later prove significant, providing some of the clearest first-hand footage of the reactions unfolding on that block before the larger spectacle of officers arriving even began. The story, still in its earliest hours, was already outpacing anyone's ability to control its direction. Inside Vance Holdings, the mood shifted from celebration to panic within hours. His communications team, who had arranged the diner visit specifically to soften his public image, now found themselves scrambling to contain a story spreading faster than they could respond to it. Calls came in from reporters requesting comment, then from investors asking pointed questions about his judgment, then from community organizers demanding a public apology. Vance initially dismissed the concern, insisting the story would fade within a news cycle like so many controversies before it. He had weathered criticism in the past over aggressive property acquisitions and had always emerged largely unscathed. What he failed to grasp was that this time, the story was no longer only about him. It was about the man he had dismissed without a second thought. His head of communications, a sharp and cautious executive named Gregory Marsh, attempted repeatedly to convince Vance of the seriousness unfolding around them, presenting screenshots of climbing view counts and mounting comment threads filled with anger, directed squarely at him. Vance waved the concerns aside initially, insisting that public outrage online rarely translated into lasting consequence, a belief that had served him well through prior scandals involving displaced tenants and aggressive buyouts. Marsh, sensing something different in the tone of this particular backlash, quietly began preparing contingency statements without waiting for explicit approval, a decision that would later prove critical once the scale of the unfolding situation became impossible to ignore. Word of the video reached the local veterans community by mid-morning, passed along through group chats and community boards frequented by former service members across the city. One retired officer, scrolling through the footage on his phone during a coffee break, paused the frame on Walter Higgins's face and felt something tighten in his chest. He zoomed in, studied the profile, and then called an old colleague, asking if he remembered a name from decades earlier. Within 20 minutes, a small circle of former officers had confirmed what seemed impossible at first. The quiet old man mocked on camera for eating a free breakfast was someone many of them had once served beside, someone whose name was quietly spoken with respect in certain circles long before badges and promotions ever entered the picture. That retired officer, a man named Thomas Riley, had once been among the very first recruits Walter trained decades earlier, and he still remembered the exact lessons Walter had taught him about leading with restraint rather than force. Riley's hands shook slightly as he dialed the number of a current deputy chief, a woman named Carla Jennings, who had also passed through Walter's training program early in her career. Jennings listened quietly as Riley explained what he had seen, and within minutes she began making calls of her own, determined to ensure the department responded appropriately to a situation involving someone who had shaped so many of their current leaders without ever asking for recognition in return. Walter Higgins had once held a position that few people outside specialized law enforcement circles would recognize by name, but every officer who came up through that department's ranks knew the story attached to it. Decades earlier, before retiring quietly and stepping away from public life entirely, he had trained a generation of officers who now held command positions across the city, teaching them not only tactics, but a code of conduct many still carried with them. He had walked away from recognition deliberately, uninterested in ceremonies or plaques, choosing instead a life so ordinary that even his closest neighbors had no idea who he had once been. He never mentioned it to Maya, not because he distrusted her, but because he had spent years trying to leave that version of himself behind entirely. As the identity confirmation spread through those old command circles, something began moving that no press release or public relations strategy could stop. Calls went out, not from any official department channel, but from officer to officer, colleague to colleague, each one passing along the same message with a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger. The man humiliated on camera that morning was not simply an elderly stranger who happened to eat breakfast alone. He was someone many of them owed their careers to, someone whose quiet mentorship had shaped how they carried themselves on the job for years. By mid-morning, without any single person giving an official order, dozens of off-duty and on-duty officers began making their way toward that same city block, each one determined to make sure Walter Higgins understood he had not been forgotten. Deputy Chief Jennings, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, made the decision to inform the police chief directly, rather than allow the gathering to happen without official acknowledgement. The chief, a measured man named Everett Boyd, who had also come up through the department during Walter's years of influence, immediately understood the weight of the situation and chose to attend personally rather than send a representative. His decision to appear in person would later be seen as a defining moment in how seriously the department treated the incident, signaling to the public that this was not simply a symbolic gesture, but a genuine acknowledgement of a debt long overdue. Meanwhile, Maya had no idea any of this was unfolding. She finished her shift as she always did, wiping down the counter, restocking napkins, and preparing for the slower midday crowd, unaware that her name was now attached to hundreds of thousands of shares across social media. Customers who came in that morning mentioned they had seen something online, but she assumed it was simply gossip about the earlier confrontation, nothing more than an uncomfortable memory she hoped would fade quickly. She had no way of knowing that reporters were already parked outside, that a small crowd had begun gathering near the entrance, or that Walter himself had quietly stepped outside for air, unaware that his own identity had just been uncovered by people who remembered him far better than he ever expected. A young reporter named Alicia Grant, dispatched by the same producer who had first flagged the viral video, arrived outside the diner, hoping simply to gather reaction interviews from customers who had witnessed the confrontation. She had no idea, standing there with her microphone and small camera crew, that she was about to witness something far larger unfold in real time. As she waited near the entrance, she noticed uniformed officers beginning to arrive in unusual numbers, far more than would typically respond to any ordinary disturbance call, and she quickly redirected her attention, sensing that the real story was only just beginning to take shape. Richard Vance, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the storm building around him until his assistant burst into his office with her phone extended, the screen displaying headline after headline forming across local news outlets. He waved her off initially, insisting it was simply another overblown internet moment that would pass by evening. It was only when his lead attorney called, voice tight with concern, mentioning that police vehicles were gathering near the diner in unusually high numbers, that Vance felt the first genuine flicker of unease. He assumed, wrongly, that the gathering officers were responding to some unrelated incident nearby. He had no idea that within the hour, he would be standing on that same sidewalk, watching an entire uniformed formation turn its attention not toward him, but toward the woman he had mocked hours earlier. His attorney, a cautious man named Howard Pratt, who had represented Vance through several prior controversies, urged him strongly to avoid returning to the diner at all, warning that his presence could escalate an already volatile situation. Vance, driven partly by pride and partly by a genuine, if belated, sense that he needed to manage the unfolding narrative personally, ignored the advice and instructed his driver to return to the same block. Patricia, sitting quietly beside him during the drive, said little, sensing that whatever awaited them there was far beyond anything careful messaging could soften. By 11 that morning, the sidewalk outside Maya's diner had become something no camera crew could have staged. Officers arrived, not in a chaotic rush, but in a quiet, deliberate procession, parking their vehicles along the block and stepping out in full uniform, greeting one another with the kind of solemn nods reserved for moments people instinctively understand matter. Bystanders who had gathered to watch the growing crowd fell silent as the formation began to take shape, sensing that whatever was about to happen carried weight far beyond an ordinary morning. Reporters who had arrived expecting only a follow-up story on viral outrage suddenly found themselves recording something entirely different, something none of their editors had prepared them to cover. Chief Boyd arrived personally among the gathered officers, choosing to stand near the front of the formation rather than observe from a distance, a decision that visibly moved several of the veteran officers present who understood the significance of his direct involvement. He spoke briefly with Deputy Chief Jennings and Thomas Riley, confirming final details before the formation prepared to honor Walter properly, ensuring that whatever unfolded next would reflect genuine respect rather than a hollow public gesture arranged for cameras. Walter Higgins stepped outside the diner just as the first line of officers began forming across the sidewalk, and for a moment he simply stood frozen, unsure whether the gathering crowd was there because of him or in spite of him. An officer near the front of the formation, a man Walter had once trained decades earlier, stepped forward first, removed his cap, and addressed him not by his first name, but by a title few people in that crowd recognized, one reserved for men who had once shaped the very foundation of their careers. One by one, the surrounding officers straightened their posture, raised their hands in salute, and held that position in complete silence, honoring a man the world had overlooked for years, right there on an ordinary sidewalk in front of an ordinary diner. Maya stepped outside moments later, drawn by the sudden hush that had fallen over the block, and found herself standing beside Walter as 50 uniformed officers held their salute in complete silence. She had no idea what any of it meant at first, only that something profound was unfolding in front of her, something connected somehow to the quiet man she had fed breakfast to for nearly 3 years without ever asking why. Cameras that had gathered to cover controversy now captured something entirely different, an image of dignity restored in real time, broadcast within minutes, to every platform that had spread the earlier humiliation just hours before. It was in that exact moment, standing beside Walter as the salute held firm, that Maya realized her simple act of kindness had never been small at all. Alicia Grant, standing near the edge of the crowd with her microphone still raised, later described the moment as unlike anything she had covered in her career, the silence on that sidewalk somehow louder than any noise could have been. She captured Walter's visible emotion as the salute continued, his composure briefly breaking before he steadied himself, Decades of restraint, meeting a moment he had never expected to witness in his lifetime. That footage, raw and unscripted, would later circulate almost as widely as the original confrontation, becoming the defining image most people associated with the entire story. Richard Vance arrived on that same sidewalk only minutes later, stepping out of his car expecting another opportunity for a curated photograph, still unaware of what had unfolded in his absence. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of a formation of officers, their attention fixed entirely on the woman and the old man he had humiliated hours earlier. The crowd that had gathered turned toward him as he approached, murmurs rippling through onlookers who recognized his face from the very video that had ignited outrage across the internet that morning. For the first time that day, Richard Vance found himself without a script, without a prepared statement, and without the practiced confidence that had carried him through every previous public controversy of his career. The police chief, who had been personally informed of Walter Higgins's identity earlier that morning, stepped forward from the formation and addressed the gathered crowd directly, thanking Walter publicly for decades of quiet service that had shaped an entire generation of officers now standing on that street. He then turned his attention toward Richard Vance, choosing his words carefully but without hesitation, stating plainly that no amount of wealth or property ownership entitled anyone to humiliate another human being in public, least of all a woman who had shown more character in 5 minutes than many people demonstrate in a lifetime. Vance opened his mouth to respond, searching for the same confident tone that had always worked in boardrooms, but found nothing there strong enough to answer the silence surrounding him. Reporters pressed forward with questions, cameras capturing every second, as Richard Vance struggled to find footing in a moment he had never anticipated. His communications team, watching from a distance, realized instantly that no prepared statement could soften what the entire city had just witnessed unfold live. Vance attempted a brief apology, his voice noticeably less steady than the tone he had used hours earlier inside that diner, acknowledging that his words had been wrong without yet understanding the full weight of who he had dismissed. The crowd's reaction remained cool, unmoved by an apology that felt more like damage control than genuine remorse, and it became clear to everyone present that this moment would not simply fade quietly the way his previous controversies always had. Gregory Marsh, watching the unfolding scene from a nearby vehicle, immediately recognized that the situation had moved far beyond anything a press statement could contain, quietly advising Vance through a brief phone call to leave the sidewalk rather than continue attempting to explain himself in front of an audience clearly unwilling to listen. Vance, humiliated and increasingly aware of how badly the moment had turned against him, eventually stepped back into his car, driven away under the weight of stares he had never before experienced, directed at himself rather than at someone beneath him. As news of the confrontation spread further that afternoon, questions began surfacing publicly about the deeper reason Vance had visited that diner in the first place. Investigative reporters, sensing a larger story beneath the viral moment, began examining recent property filings connected to that block, uncovering a pending acquisition deal that would have forced Maya's diner and several neighboring businesses to close within months. What had appeared at first to be an isolated incident of arrogance now revealed itself as something more calculated, a public relations visit designed to soften opposition to a redevelopment plan that would displace the very community Vance claimed to be honoring. The revelation shifted public anger from a single embarrassing moment toward a far broader pattern of behavior. A financial journalist named Marcus Webb, who had covered Vance Holdings for several years, was among the first to connect the diner visit to the pending acquisition, publishing an article within hours that laid out the timeline in careful detail. Webb's reporting revealed that Vance had scheduled the diner visit specifically to generate goodwill before the redevelopment announcement, hoping favorable press coverage might soften anticipated backlash from displaced tenants. Instead, the visit had produced the opposite effect entirely, exposing not only his personal arrogance, but the calculated nature of the entire public relations strategy behind it. Vance's board of directors, already uneasy about the viral video circulating across every major platform, grew significantly more concerned once reporters began connecting his diner visit to the redevelopment filings. Shareholders who valued stability above controversy began questioning his judgment publicly, while community advocacy groups organized swiftly, using the momentum of that single morning to demand the acquisition deal be reconsidered entirely. What Vance had hoped would remain a private business transaction, hidden behind polished press releases, now stood exposed in front of an audience far larger than he had ever imagined possible. Every attempt his team made to control the narrative only seemed to deepen public scrutiny, turning one viral moment into a citywide conversation about power, displacement, and who truly deserved protection. An emergency board meeting was convened that same evening, with several members expressing open frustration at how badly the situation had been handled from its earliest stages. One senior board member, a longtime investor named Diane Castillo, argued forcefully that the company needed to distance itself entirely from the redevelopment plan rather than attempt to defend it, warning that continued association with the controversy risked lasting damage to every other project the company had underway. Vance, uncharacteristically quiet during much of the meeting, found himself agreeing with her assessment, a rare moment of humility that surprised colleagues accustomed to his usual unwavering confidence in every decision he made. By early afternoon, Maya found herself surrounded by reporters eager to understand who she was, beyond the video that had made her a household name across the city within hours. She answered their questions with the same quiet composure she had shown that morning, insisting repeatedly that she had done nothing extraordinary, only what she believed anyone should do for another human being in need. Her daughter, watching news coverage from school after teachers pulled up the story on a classroom screen, later told her mother she had never been prouder, a moment Maya would describe afterward as more meaningful to her than any attention from cameras or officials. For Maya, the true weight of that day had never been about recognition, but about refusing to let cruelty go unanswered. Aaliyah's teacher, moved by the story unfolding on the classroom screen, later reached out to Maya directly, offering to help coordinate a small community fund should Maya ever need support securing her daughter's future education. Maya, humbled by the gesture, initially hesitated to accept any form of assistance, uncomfortable with the idea of receiving help she had not asked for. It would take gentle encouragement from friends and neighbors over the following weeks before she accepted that allowing others to extend kindness back to her was not a contradiction of her values, but a natural continuation of them. Walter Higgins, overwhelmed by the sudden attention directed his way, spoke briefly to reporters as well, choosing his words carefully after decades of avoiding public recognition entirely. He explained that he had never sought acknowledgement for his years of service, and that the quiet kindness Maya offered him each morning meant more to him than any medal or title from his past. He described her simply as the only person in years who had treated him like a person rather than a burden, a statement that spread almost as quickly across social media as the original video itself. For many watching, it became the emotional center of the entire story, a reminder that quiet decency often mattered more than any grand gesture ever could. Later that evening, Walter's estranged son, having seen the footage online from several states away, called his father for the first time in nearly 2 years, visibly moved by the public reckoning of a man he had always known privately to be humble almost to a fault. Their conversation, brief and cautious at first, marked the beginning of a slow reconciliation neither of them had expected that single ordinary morning to produce, a quiet subplot that would continue unfolding gently over the following months. By late afternoon, Vance Holdings issued a formal statement acknowledging the controversy and announcing an internal review of its recent property acquisitions, including the deal tied to Maya's block. Community organizers, wary of corporate statements designed to quiet public anger without meaningful action, continued pressing for concrete guarantees that the businesses along that street would remain protected. Reporters noted the unusual optics of a company forced into transparency not through investigative journalism alone, but through a single viral moment captured by an ordinary bystander with a smartphone. For the first time in years, Richard Vance found himself reacting to public pressure rather than shaping it, a shift that unsettled him far more than any boardroom disagreement ever had. That evening, as the story continued dominating headlines and social feeds across the country, Maya returned home to find her small apartment filled with flowers, cards, and messages from strangers she had never met, all expressing gratitude for the quiet dignity she had shown that morning. She sat with her daughter, replaying the events of the day, still struggling to reconcile the ordinary woman she considered herself to be with the symbol so many now saw her as. Walter, meanwhile, sat alone in his own modest apartment, holding the same worn photograph he always carried, reflecting quietly on a day that had unearthed a past he thought he had buried for good. Neither of them had asked for recognition, yet both found themselves forever changed by a single ordinary morning. In the days that followed, Vance Holdings formally withdrew its acquisition plans for that block, citing what its statement carefully called community feedback rather than public embarrassment. Local officials moved quickly to protect the diner and surrounding businesses through a preservation designation, ensuring the block could not face similar pressure again in the near future. Richard Vance, still attempting to salvage what remained of his public image, requested a private meeting with Maya and Walter, arriving without cameras or publicists this time, a detail reporters would later note as significant. Whether his change of heart reflected genuine remorse or simple damage control remained a question many continued to debate long after the headlines eventually faded. During that private meeting, Vance apologized directly to both Maya and Walter, acknowledging that his words that morning had reflected years of assuming wealth, entitled him to judge people he knew nothing about. Maya listened quietly, neither forgiving him instantly nor holding on to bitterness, choosing instead to accept his apology as a starting point rather than a resolution. Walter, drawing on decades of experience reading people carefully, offered him a simple piece of advice rather than absolution, telling him that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in how a person treats those who can offer nothing in return. Vance left that meeting visibly shaken, carrying words that would follow him long after the cameras had moved on to other stories. In the weeks that followed, Vance quietly began funding a small scholarship in Aaliyah's name through a third-party organization, careful to avoid any public announcement that might appear self-serving. Maya only learned of his involvement months later, choosing to accept the gesture on her daughter's behalf without allowing it to define her opinion of the man who had humiliated her that morning. It became, for her, simply one small piece of a much larger story about how people are capable of change when confronted honestly with the harm they have caused. In the months that followed, Maya's diner became something of a quiet landmark, not because of elaborate renovations or marketing campaigns, but because people from across the city began stopping by, simply to meet the woman whose composure had captured national attention. She continued working the same early shift, pouring coffee and serving breakfast exactly as she always had, insisting that nothing about her daily life needed to change, simply because millions of strangers now recognized her face. Walter continued visiting each morning as well, no longer hiding behind quiet anonymity, but never seeking attention either. Content instead to sit in his familiar corner booth while sharing conversation with a woman who had shown him kindness long before the world ever knew his name. Richard Vance's career never fully recovered the trust it once carried, even after his company's public reforms and increased transparency around future development projects. Investors and community leaders alike remained cautious, watching closely to see whether his changed behavior reflected lasting growth or simply careful public relations management following a costly mistake. Some believed his private apology to Maya and Walter marked a genuine turning point, while others remained skeptical, pointing out that true change is proven over years, not single conversations. The story left that question deliberately unresolved, allowing audiences to decide for themselves whether redemption is something that can be claimed instantly or something that must be earned slowly over time, through consistent action rather than words alone. What remained undeniable, long after the cameras disappeared and the headlines moved on to other stories, was the image burned into public memory that single morning. 50 officers, standing in silent salute on an ordinary sidewalk, honoring a quiet veteran, and the young woman who had shown him kindness without ever expecting recognition in return. It became a story less about wealth and power, and more about the quiet strength found in ordinary people who choose decency, even when no one is watching. Maya Coleman never set out to become a symbol of anything. She simply believed that kindness should never require permission, and that belief, more than any headline or salute, became the true legacy of that single, unforgettable morning. Would you have recognized dignity standing quietly in a corner booth, or would you have walked past it the way Richard Vance almost did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, stay close, because the next story we're about to share carries a twist even more unexpected than this one. Thank you for watching until the very end, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter in stories that remind us who we really are.